And now is the time when you can click to agree to this meeting being recorded. So good evening, everyone who is joining this ACTR webinar, meeting the challenge of teaching second languages to students with learning disabilities. And I want to introduce first the Professional Development Committee of ACTR, who develops this programming for membership. It's me, Irina Dubinina. It's and I'm going by the order in which you appear on my screen. It's Lee Robbie. It's Susan Presson. I don't know if you want to wave at everyone. It's Olga Klimova, and it's John Rook, and it's also Irina Kogel as of recently. And so this is our team. And as many of you know, we started, many of you who have participated in the teachers' lounges that we have been organizing for a number of years now. A big part of our conversation lately has been hearing from diverse voices in the field and tackling the question of how we can make Russian language classrooms more inclusive, more diverse, and more accessible. And so this webinar comes under that same umbrella of making our classrooms more inclusive and more accessible to all kinds of students. And we're very happy to welcome to our webinar, I'm sorry, I will admit another person. Our presenter today, Linda Hacker, Professor Emerita, who was a founding faculty member of Landmark College, established in 1985 for students who learn differently, including those with learning disabilities, such as attention deficit disorder and autism spectrum disorder. Linda served in multiple roles, directing tutorial and teacher training programs, teaching English, study skills, and music classes, and as an academic advisor and dean. She was appointed to the Landmark College Institute for Research and Training in 2001, where she led professional learning initiatives for educators around the world. Linda is the author of numerous articles and book chapters, including work on multisensory learning and supportive technology. And it gives me special pleasure to say that Linda received a BA from Brandeis University, and her master's in education is from the University of Hartford. So Linda, you most welcome in this group of teachers of Russian language and Russian culture and literature. And we are a diverse group that teaches at both pre-college and post-secondary levels. And welcome everyone who is here. I just want to say that Linda will be presenting and will be sharing slides. If you have any questions, it's probably during the presentation, probably best to put them in the chat. I will try to monitor the chat to the best of my ability and read questions to Linda, but please, you can also unmute yourselves and ask questions when we come to that moment in the webinar. And with this, Linda, please take it away.
Yeah, no, thank you. I'm very honored to be here, and as an alum of Brandeis, especially the connection to Brandeis is very dear to me. I majored in linguistics at Brandeis, and that was really the basis for my future work in working with students who learn differently, in understanding the challenges of acquiring language and the fascinating, endlessly fascinating variations of between different languages and how languages function. And so I owe a debt of gratitude to my roots at Brandeis. And I'm especially pleased to be part of your series on inclusion and diversity. I think the most important kind of passionate commitment of my career has been to making room, especially in higher education, and especially in language studies, for students who learn differently, so that the amazing gifts and talents that they are capable of bringing to academic discourse can be effectively shared in the academic community. And it's especially the kind of in language studies, second language study is really where the rubber hits the road for students who learn differently, as we're about to find out. So shall I perhaps begin sharing my slides now? Would that be good? Yeah. Let's see. Okay, let's just make sure, can people now see the lead slide? Okay, good.
Perfect. We can.
Wonderful. So as Irina mentioned, we're be talking about increasing access to world language, supporting students with language learning difficulties. And notice I didn't say disabilities, because people who experience difficulties learning second languages are certainly not limited to people who qualify as having a learning disability. And yet there can be many reasons. And so the point of most of what I hope to share is helping us understand what are some of the underlying factors so that we can effectively address them in our curriculum and in our educational practices. And I just wanted to start with a shout out to my wonderful colleagues at Landmark College who, and their names are there, who were pioneers in developing post-secondary language programs specifically for students with learning disabilities, and from whom I learned so very much. So our framing questions for tonight are, I hope that we can answer these questions. What is the cognitive basis of language learning? And specifically, how do language processing, memory, and attention, which are some of the foundations of learning anything, how do those interact and how do they impact language learning in particular? And that will lead us to a better understanding of what causes some students to struggle in second language classes more than the next student. And of course, most pressing, what instructional techniques are going to support effective language study for our diverse learners? And I will be very happy to answer additional questions from you, and you can either, interrupt me or put the questions in the chat. So we're first going to look at the language learning and the roles played by language processing, memory, and attention, specifically when acquiring a second language as an adult. As I'm sure you know, adult language learning is quite different from learning a second language as a young child. For one thing, there does appear to be a critical developmental period for implicitly learning multiple languages that we have when we're young, which tends to fade out as we develop. By the time we hit puberty, that window for like optimal, effortless language learning is really greatly reduced, and it requires a lot more conscious effort. And then for at-risk learners, the effort is magnified. So we'll take a look at how that works. And we'll start with language-based difficulties. And well, let's see. Oh, there's a actually, before we do, yes, there's a challenge that I wanted to have. If I want you to think about a student who has struggled in your Russian class, despite seemingly adequate effort and motivation. So somebody who really wants to learn a language and seems committed, but is having a hard time compared to other students in your classes. And to think about what aspects of language learning are the most difficult or challenging for this student. And so let me give you a moment or a minute or two to think about that and maybe post some of your observations using the chat function. Okay, so I'm going to sit back and be quiet for a minute, and I'll time us so to keep us on track. Mm-hmm. Hmm. Wow. Yeah, you are hitting all the high notes for sure. If people can take a look in the chat, there've been numerous mentions of pronunciation, and along with pronunciation, kind of the flip side of pronunciation, spelling, retaining vocabulary, recognizing pattern, being able to consistently spell one's name correctly. Yeah, we're going to see that. And then, of course, when you're very, let's say, error prone in a language class, then the motivation to talk and participate is greatly reduced because you don't want to stand out for looking poorly, fear of mispronouncing, writing, reading, phonics, pronunciation, absolutely. So yeah, and so we're going to take a look at why those specific issues seem to rise to the forefront for the well-motivated student who's really struggling in a language classroom. Whoops. Okay, so here, let's take a look at, so as a language teachers, we assume some things about what students bring to our language classes based on the fact that they are highly proficient speakers and users of their native language in general. So we expect that our students know how the sounds of a language can be represented by a symbol and consistently represented. We assume that they know what parts of speech are and can recognize them. And we're talking about first language knowledge, that they read and write easily in their native language, as well as follow oral directions in their native language. And then when it gets to second language, that they recognize cognates. They see that words that have common roots across languages probably share meanings. That if we say a new word to them, that they can repeat it back accurately first time, preferably. And on general, that they're going to draw on everything that they know about their first language to learn their new language. And it turns out that for the students who are struggling in second language classes, that their competence in their native language has some gaps or holes. And it may not have risen to the level of a qualified or diagnosed learning disability when they were in when they were in earlier grades. But when they come to learn a second language, these difficulties kind of jump up to haunt them. And the first people who came up with a really compelling theory to explain why certain groups of students seem to have more difficulty than others in learning second languages were Richard Sparks and Lenore Ganschow. And they had to have a fancy name for their theory, and they called it the linguistic coding difference hypothesis. But boiled down to essentials, they're saying that first language skills highly influence second language learning. And the students who are going to struggle in your second language class at heart have weaker phonological and orthographic and syntactic skills than their peers. And again, that they might not have risen to the level of a diagnosed disability in their native language, where there's lots and lots of redundancy, but it becomes problematic in their second language learning. And that these difficulties really range from very mild to severe. And of course, so if we look into so it behooves us when we're working with students who are struggling in a second language class to try to talk to them or find out in some non-threatening way a little bit about their educational background and their experiences in especially the early grades, learning to read, write, and spell. And if we look into their educational history, we often find that they have a history of reading problems, that they struggle with writing and particularly spelling. And even well-remediated adult dyslexics often have very telltale spelling difficulties we're talking about native language. That yes, they can read, but it might take them longer. They're slow readers, Sometimes they might have difficulty generating oral language on demand, rapidly in an anxiety-provoking situation. They might be a little fuzzy about grammar, even in their first language. And so these are some of the underpinning skills that are going to show up in the second language classroom. And so the skills that, and we found that one of the best ways to predict who's going to struggle in a second language is the modern language aptitude test. Do people still use the modern language aptitude test? I'm not sure. It's been a while since I taught it was an aptitude test that you said that you could predict how well people could do in second language learning. But if we really want to know who's going to struggle with a second language, looking at their early elementary school language performance, especially in the areas of reading, spelling, and early writing, are going to be quite good predictors. So the interesting thing is that it's not all aspects of language that cause the problems for these students. It's really limited to phonological processing, dealing with the way the sounds of the language, recognizing sounds that are similar, discriminating sounds, remembering sounds in the right order. It may also have to do with processing larger amounts of language, not at the sound and word level, but at the phrase and sentence and paragraph level. It's going to involve spelling, and it may, to a lesser extent, involve syntax or sentence and phrase structure. So what's not impaired in language, interestingly enough, is overall comprehension or depth of vocabulary. Although we'll see that there are difficulties learning new vocabulary, but in general, they may be quite fluent in their native language and have a wide vocabulary. And if we have access to educational records from these students, we might find that they were called these various things in their early years. They might have been diagnosed as dyslexic, or have a specific language disability, or weak language processing. There are a whole lot of terms, or just being called at risk. And so I want to drill down a little bit into what dyslexia is, because it's probably the biggest single category of language learning difficulty that's likely to crop up in second language learning. But I do want to be very clear that students can have the underlying characteristics of dyslexia without it having been severe enough when they were young to have gotten a diagnosis. However, because they struggle with these underlying language skills, they have difficulty when it comes to second language. So it's generally considered intrinsic. That is, people are born with it. There's a very large genetic component. That's what they mean by constitutional origin. And the people who struggle with it have difficulty with processing the sounds of language. And again, hearing how many sounds are in a word, and being able to manipulate the sounds in a word. So if I ask you, how many sounds are in the word cat? How many sounds are in the word cat? You can hold up your fingers, or, yeah, 3. Very good, okay. And then I ask you, how many sounds are in the word catch? Okay, we have less agreement here because it gets a little tricky. Yeah, it's actually still 3, and you have to know the English phonological system. Is a single phoneme in English, and I don't know the Russian, phonemic system very well. But you can see if there are differences between the way Russian phonemes work and English phonemes work. that students who struggle in this area are going to be somewhat hung up on hearing and distinguishing sounds. So the way this will show up, so they have trouble with how many sounds are in the word and manipulating. So if I say the word cat without the, it would be at. Or if I say the word cat, but substitute an for an it's cut. And students, most people, even at a very young age, have no problem manipulating the sounds of language. But students who are dyslexic have a much harder time doing those phonological processing tasks. And so it all boils down to when you give them single words to read in a list without context, they could struggle to recognize those words, and they struggle to recognize them very as quickly and automatically as is necessary for reading. And these underlying, very brain-based difficulties in processing and manipulating the sounds of language then shows up. So it doesn't affect speaking in general. We don't have to know how many sounds are in a word to speak and understand. But when we have to map it onto a code, a written code where sounds are represented by symbols, then we get conspicuous problems with reading and spelling. And then because spelling is foundational to writing, to higher forms of writing as well. And I thought I would give you just a tiny simulation taste of what it might feel like to be an adult dyslexic reader. And so if you will indulge me for a minute, this is a simulation from the PBS, Public Broadcasting System website, All Kinds of Minds. And the challenge is there's a passage halfway down the page, to read the passage aloud to yourself, but certain of the letters have been replaced with other letters than the ones that you're expecting. So let me give you a moment, let me give you a minute to try to read this, and then we'll talk about it briefly. Is that enough time? Are you ready to give a quick summary of the passage? John, I notice you nodding your head. So what does this feel like? And this, you know, I cannot say that this is exactly what a dyslexic person experiences. It's not. This is just a simulation, but it's an attempt to give a non-dyslexic person a small glimpse into what it might feel like to be a reader, even a well-remediated adult dyslexic reader, with reading some academic passage. So if people want to put in the chat or even speak out what the experience is like. Whoops, let's see the new messages. Like, yes, we're just, I want to give up. Okay. Yes. And yeah, brain can't, yeah, I can't even guess. So I did give up. So that is the experience, is that for even adult remediated dyslexics, reading can be exhausting because in fact, their brains are working harder to process the sounds. It has not become as automatic as it would be for someone for whom it was easy to learn. Plus there's that overlay of kind of anxiety and resistance that you have when you're doing something that you know you're not so great at, or that was difficult for you when you were learning it. So, and you have to ask yourself, if reading were like that, how often would you be tempted to pick up a book or a magazine article? Okay, so I want to drill down. I mentioned that phonological processing was one of the core deficits that characteristic of dyslexics or people who are going to be struggling in second language. And the phonological processing works at both the receptive, listening and reading, and then expressive level, talking and writing. So the receptive level, it involves isolating sound. So hearing a sound and being able to say, oh, that's a t in there, that must be a T. Recognizing sounds and distinguishing similar sounds, recognizing that some sounds are similar, like in B are the same sound, except one is voiced and one is not. And based on all that, being able to associate those sounds with the symbols, the alphabet that were given. And of course, with Russian studies, if you're working with native English speakers, then learning this whole new orthographic system presents, a layer of difficulty that they wouldn't have if they were taking Spanish, or I wouldn't say French, German, or Finnish, or some language that's highly phonetically regular and still in a Latin script. And then in terms of expression, being able to blend sounds to make a word, and then to be able to hear how a word is sounding and spell it accurately with the right sequence of sounds. So when dyslexic students or students who have dyslexic tendencies are dealing with new phonological systems, learning new vocabulary in a new language, they typically may add letters, mix up letters, omit letters when they're writing a word. The word looks very familiar, but it's not quite right. They can, so that's at the sound level. They may also add or drop syllables. And a frequent phenomenon, I know the beginning and the end of the word, but somehow the middle has escaped me. And I wish I had a whole lot of sample errors that show up in students speaking and writing in Russian. But because my errors are drawn from the Landmark Language Studies Department, they taught Spanish, French, and sign language, which was a super language for our different learners. So these are the errors that one very student with severe phonological processing problems had in her work. And I actually worked with this student. And I will say that of all the students I ever worked with, she had the most kind of noticeable difficulty with phonological processing. I was her academic advisor. And one day she came and said, Ms. Hecker, how come we're always talking about orgasms in biology class? And I said, I don't know, let's look at that word. So let's tap it out. So when we tapped out the word, and we actually did this like this, organism, we tapped it out. And then she realized that she had been misreading the word all along. But so that was in English. These are some of her errors in Spanish. So on the left in red is the error, and the target word is on the right. And I've made some of these errors myself in Spanish, but so I'm thinking whether you can come up with some equivalent sample errors in Russian that you see in your students. In other words, does this resonate? Do you see this kind of error when students are either speaking or writing? And yeah, okay. Okay, so that's at the phonological processing level. There is something called auditory processing that affects quite a lot of students. And this is students who have trouble processing oral language more at the word, phrase, and sentence level. In other words, they have difficulty understanding and participating in oral language as rapidly and accurately as the next student. So because of this, they just can't process it fast enough to keep up with ordinary speech. And so they miss important chunks of information. And like we were in that reading sample, they can become mentally exhausted listening and just kind of give up because they know they just can't keep up. And this also results in difficulty learning new vocabulary. Often I find that instruction in second language classes requires students to process a lot of information orally through our ears. And this type of learning is very problematic for students who have this difficulty. And it is quite typical that slower processing of oral language is often associated with dyslexia, auditory processing, and also with students on the autism spectrum. So that in itself impedes the ability to understand and express oral language. Memory, some of you mentioned difficulty learning new vocabulary, and I would say language learning has a much higher rote memory load than almost any other academic course for students. There are very few other subjects where there's so much terminology, and unlike physics, where you can do an experiment and hands-on or watch a video, you can't bypass the language demands of a language class, right? The medium is the message, it's the content, but it's also the medium of delivery and instruction. It's all language all the time, and that makes it quite challenging. So why is memory so difficult? Well, so oral language is so ephemeral, right? If we're going to understand it, we have to receive it and process it before it fades. It's, there's only a little window, and there's something that's called working memory, which allows us to hold information for just a few seconds while we're trying to figure out what we have to do with it. And one way you never notice is somebody gives you a set of directions or a phone number, and you have to go somewhere to write it down. You don't have your phone with you. One way you can keep it refreshed is by mentally saying it, saying it over and over to yourself. You can refresh it with rehearsal. But this is called the articulatory loop. And as we hear ourselves, feel our mouth making the sounds and ears hearing the sounds, we can hold on to memory. But often the dialogue in a language class is going on faster than students can keep up with in terms of their ability to keep that information fresh in their memory. So here are some of the typical difficulties that we might see in a second language class. So confusing similar sounding words and similar looking words. So these are the errors that that same student made. Somebody mentioned didn't recognize student not seeing patterns. That's very typical of students with language processing, is that they're focusing very much on the detail level and missing the patterns. So student doesn't recognize that dos cientos, tres cientos are part of a pattern that you can use to predict and remember. Don't recognize cognates, aren't thinking about the way words are structured in our native language to help make a bridge or stepping stone to the second language. Now in Russian, of course, there are fewer cognates than there might be in French or Spanish, but still that pattern recognition is so important. And then in terms of output, so if you're inputting or encoding information incorrectly to start with, then when it comes time to retrieve and say the word or write the word, then it's much harder. So a lot of confusion with words that might start with the same sound. So that was one student trying to get to the quinientos, and a slower retrieval time. And also because students have trouble retrieving stored language, they may be slow to understand oral language, which means they miss some opportunities for practice. One of the most kind of interesting and articulate discussions of what it feels like to have these struggles as a second language learner is an article by Charlene Simon, who was a speech language pathologist and an ESL, English second language specialist, who was dyslexic, wrote a first-person account of her difficulty learning French. And this was published in the Annals of Dyslexia. So she says, just because I've learned a word doesn't mean it will be available. And words with more than two or three syllables fade from memory once I begin to articulate them, with the vowels especially susceptible to distortion. And her account is really remarkable because she's so insightful about her difficulties. She's highly intelligent, and she's still really having a hard time learning French, but she can offer us the insights from the inside of why that's happening and what it feels like. Okay, before I move on to other kinds of difficulties, and this is a shorter segment, I'd be happy to take questions. We just covered a really big chunk about language processing and all the aspects of language, so particularly phonology, orthography, spelling, and to a lesser extent, syntax. So, are there questions about the basic language processing? Yeah, these are really good. By the observations in the chat were really good.
It may take longer to type the questions if you
Yeah.
have questions, to just raise your hand. So please feel free to
Yeah.
unmute yourself and ask the question, but I see there is a question.
Yeah. Oh, music and dyslexia. Yes, it does help to sing a lot. And that's one of the things that they learned in the language classes at Landmark, that having songs and jingles for all sorts of common, for vowel, for vowel types and for conjugations, and singing simple folk songs is very, very helpful. There's no intrinsic link between dyslexia and music, but music being so diffuse across the whole brain, language is largely a function of left brain areas, and music being much more diffuse and encompassing many more right brain areas can be an incredible support or catalyst for learning language. And there are all sorts of examples of people who had strokes who couldn't speak, but when you gave them music, they were able to actually sing along and find the words that go with the song, because the music helps retrieve that. So yeah, using music and jingles, very good idea for language class. Trying to see if there, I think that's the last question there. Let me go on then to,
I think there's another question. What is the connection between dyslexia and difficulty with oral perception testing? If you know anything about this.
Yeah. Well, I think that's talking about what I refer to as auditory processing. But I'm not sure whether you mean dyslexia. I will say dyslexia is specifically difficulty with processing the sounds of language and the sounds of language. So people who have trouble processing the sound of language don't necessarily have difficulty processing other kinds of sounds, like pitch, like the other elements of music, like sounds in nature. It's specific to language rather than a comprehensive hearing or listening or brain-based oral perception. Yeah. So there's no, and also people who have trouble reading don't necessarily have trouble reading music, because again, we're talking about, reading stuff that's basically language, as opposed to reading symbolic language, symbols that don't represent language. Yeah. Okay. I can talk more about that later. I think maybe go on to attention. So a lot of students have diagnosed of attention deficit these days, way more than 20 years ago, I'm sure. But there does not seem to be any inherent intrinsic barrier to learning a second language that's caused by attention. Okay, unlike dyslexia, which is all about language processing. So having ADHD in and of itself is not a barrier to learning a language, but it can definitely interfere with success in a classroom for a bunch of reasons. And often there's an overlap between dyslexia and ADHD in individuals, as we'll see. But a student who has attention difficulties often have trouble figuring out what's really important in the welter of details that they hear in class, so they don't focus on key material. And then students with inconsistent focus miss a lot of important details. So if their attention is fading in and out, they can very well be missing chunks of information that are foundational. And even more students may have difficulty with executive function, which has to do with planning and moving towards a goal. It's the part of the brain that acts a little bit like the conductor or the CEO of an organization. So students with executive function problems, they have trouble managing their materials, getting their work done on time, especially if it's a long range project. These are students who miss class, or they come in late. They seem to be just disorganized in their general life, and basically putting in the sustained effort over time to stick with language, which is so incremental and cumulative. So, but unlike dyslexia, it's not an inherent intrinsic barrier to language learning. I mentioned that there's a lot of overlap between dyslexia and ADHD. Some people say 30 to 50%, depending on who's counting. So it would be nice if you were dyslexic, you were immune to having attention issues, but it's actually just the opposite. You're more susceptible. So you may suspect that a student has difficulties in both those areas. When I first started talking about this topic, students on the autism spectrum were not so prevalent, but they definitely are in academia today. So I wanted to briefly mention some of the special issues with students with autism spectrum. As you're probably aware, their main difficulties are in social interaction, sometimes in verbal and nonverbal communication. But the students who wind up in your language class in college are probably very high functioning in terms of autism spectrum. They're not the no language kids. But students in your class who have difficulty because of ASD may have trouble. So this is one thing. It's talked about theory of mind. We say people with on the spectrum have difficulty understanding, reading emotions, being socially appropriate. And a little simulation of that is if I were to ask you to, tell me what are these creatures thinking and feeling, we would really have a hard time because we don't know how to read the expressions on these faces, just as a student with ASD may have trouble reading expressions and tuning into the how other people in the class, what they're thinking and how they're reacting to them. But in class, these are students who may have trouble with the so-called pragmatics or being socially appropriate. So participating appropriately in group work or in dialogues can be an issue sometimes. A lot of trouble with idioms and figurative language because they tend to be very literal in the way they interpret language, and they may be very skilled in language, have tremendous vocabulary learning capability, but idioms sort of like, what? How does that work? And a difficulty dealing with transitions or any changes in routine or timing, like when there's a holiday week and things get upset or there's a snowstorm. So and you may be seeing other issues in your classes. I'm curious, let me take like 30 seconds for people to maybe put in the chat what issues you're seeing with students on the spectrum in your language class. Yeah. Well, somebody said you think a student 1 in 5 students with ASD in your schools. I know at Landmark College, they could easily fill the entire student body with students on the spectrum, no problem. And difficult, and certainly in tech schools, science and technology schools, there's always been a strong subset of students on the spectrum. Yeah. Yeah, difficulty working in groups, pair work, yes, group communication, and yes, rigid thinking, and a lot of difficulty. They're very, very rule bound. They, want everything to be predictable and one answer and always the same way, for sure. Yeah, yeah, doing oral presentations for others. Yeah. Good, those are excellent. So how can we support those students? For one thing, predict, and this will of course help everybody, is if we can establish routines and procedures and make sure that if things are going to be different, we give them enough advance warning for any changes in routine. Being super explicit about our expectations, not only for work, like a rubric for work, but for behavior. And often you may need to actually have a one-on-one meeting with a student and be very clear about what behavior is not acceptable in the class, and explain why, and perhaps help the students monitor their behavior, because they sometimes are not aware of how they're coming across to others. In terms of reducing anxiety, if you can reasonably provide an option out of a group project for a student who has difficulty working in groups. And if you see students who need, are looking like they're heading towards a meltdown, having some predetermined arrangements for leaving the class quietly, getting themselves under control, coming back if they're really stressing out a lot. So based on everything that we've covered so far, why do these at-risk students fail language classes? And what we spent the first, oh my gosh, almost hour talking about, and I'll have to move ahead here. We talked about the intrinsic factors that are intrinsic to the students, like language memory and attention. But there are also some curricular issues that make language classes more difficult for students. In general, we assume that language students come with intact language processing, and many language classes are very oral, which overtax students' auditory processing and working memory, or the pace of instruction is too rapid, so they don't have enough time to master the content, or because it's oral, there's not enough support with written or multisensory materials. And sometimes textbooks cause their own problems. They can be heavily language-based. Also, programmatically, teachers are not generally well informed about the needs of students who are cognitively diverse, and probably have not had a lot of training or mentoring for making the classes more accessible to students who are cognitively diverse. And one of the for me, the sad ones is that the students with difficulties are often steered away from language classes in the earlier grades. They're given exemptions or substitutions. And then when it comes to college and there's a language requirement, they're like doubly disadvantaged. So they may not have had earlier exposure to language like their peers. And so given all those challenges, why should we bother advocating for students with learning difficulties in our classes. Well, for one thing, it's a degree requirement in so many places, and especially for graduate degrees. But based on the experience of students at Landmark, a lot of students with these difficulties can be very successful with modifications to the courses. So I have a couple of quotes from Landmark students who studied. One of them, I was told I would never learn Spanish and that I required a language exemption in high school. I currently use Spanish every day at work. Another student said, after taking Spanish, I backpacked across Spain with a certain level of ease and constantly refer back to the dialogues or material from class, and I could navigate through the streets of Barcelona by asking and understanding directions completely in Spanish. Or was it Catalan? I'm not sure, but, and I was able to engage in basic conversations with locals, allowing me to experience Spanish culture at a much deeper level. So with good instruction, students can be very, very successful. And that's kind of what, I hope to share some of what we learned in the language programs at Landmark about effective practices. So I don't know, these are some of the pioneers in research-based language programs for students with learning differences. I'm not going to go into all of them, but to say that there are basically two models, at least at the post-secondary level. One is the mainstreaming where, and there's a lot of overlap between these two, but the mainstreaming is inclusion or mainstreaming. And this is where students with learning differences are mixed in with everybody else, with more typical learners. And they may be offered accommodations like extended time on tests or tests in a private room or computer support in class. Sometimes they're offered tutors. Some schools are trying to adopt universal design where there are more options for assessment for everybody. And in some of the models, I find this model very interesting. They call it a learning assistant paired course where students attend a mainstream course, but then they've got an extra class. It's sort of like an extra session or section taught by a grad student or a tutor where they get extra support for what areas they need help in, even though they're main classes with everybody else. The other option are self-contained courses that were designed specifically for students with learning differences. And sometimes that's done by having like a linguistics course that they take ahead of their foreign language class, where they learn to deal with the difficulties of phonology and spelling and learning vocabulary. Sometimes the curriculum itself, Calvin College, Winthrop College, College of William and Mary, I think the University of Denver, I think, had an extremely well-known language program specifically for students with learning disabilities, where students were tracked separately and had several levels of courses they could take part in. And then there are some courses where the methods that are used for teaching dyslexic kids to read and write are incorporated, and I'll talk a little bit about those. So I just want to move on to Landmark College, where I worked for so many years, was very fortunate, had a FIPSE grant, which was, I wrote down what that was. Fund for Improving Post-Secondary Education, where Landmark College in the 1990s was paired up. Do you all know about the School for International Training? It was a very famous international training and language school that happened to be in Brattleboro, which is the next town to where Landmark is in Putney. And so it tapped the foreign language teaching expertise of the School for International Training and the learning disabilities expertise of Landmark College. And they worked together for 3 years to develop a set of best practices. And those are what I would like to share with you now. But before I go on, are there any questions? Yeah, no, it's interesting. People made some very observations very good observations about some of the things that students have experienced with kind of prejudice against students even taking a foreign language. Yeah. Okay, so okay, so here are we call them the top 7, and so I'll try to do say a little bit about each one, in sharing with some examples. So teaching multimodally. This is important because foreign language instruction is often heavily auditory. And for students with language processing difficulties, that kind of instruction is problematic and is likely to result in frustration. So how do you incorporate multimodal learning? What teachers learned at Landmark is to incorporate a lot of visual, kinesthetic, and even motor, getting up, moving around kinds of instruction along with the oral. So combining the hearing and the speaking language with seeing and doing it, using a lot of realia, acting out dialogues, not just reading or saying dialogues, employing something called total physical response techniques, where basically it's like an acting class or an improv class. So for instance, in this picture, so I was able to go in and take pictures in some of the language classrooms at Landmark. There's a French class, and you can see there's a lot of, you can't see them too well, but there are things on the wall that help with like different kinds of verb endings. The teacher is has a little toy actually that is a swimmer. It's like a wind-up toy. And she was introducing the word for swim in French. And the students actually kind of played with this toy as they said the word for swim. So it was a much more multimodal experience than just hearing and saying the word. This is a picture drawn by a Landmark student to illustrate her experience with multimodal learning. And you see that her teachers actually included a wide variety of activities, and one focused on auditory and another on verbal and another speaking and tactile kinesthetic, but she's still confused and unhappy, and she has a lot of questions. And the follow-up to that is that on the next slide, she's happy and successful because each activity that they engage in involves all of those together: visual, auditory, kinesthetic together. And as one of our students said, the more you speak, draw, write, draw, move, and think the language, the more complete the learning process will be. So kind of really having a very active classroom. And these are some pictures of what we call multimodal dialogues, where the students are, he's buying an ice cream cone and he's got a little plastic ice cream cone, and they're really acting it out. Here they're at a restaurant and the dialogue is on the menu. So the dialogue, the spoken dialogue, is supported with written dialogue, so it's not overtaxing their working memory to practice the dialogue. And they're serving, they take turns being the waiter and the customers. So it's important to optimize that visual support. So it needs to be designed and explained. So instance, if you do a My Family exercise and you're doing a family tree, explaining how that works. For realia, instead of just the realias are these props, basically. With the spoken word, use the realia plus an index card with a written label plus the spoken word. Personalizing the curriculum so that it focuses on the practical uses of language. This is, structuring the language and activities for success. Focusing on the practical uses of language more than the finer points of grammar. So here's a thing that we found at Landmark. We say go deep, but not fast. For students, especially if you have a self-contained class, it takes longer, especially in the initial stages. So at Landmark, they found that they could cover a semester's worth of, first year introduction, Spanish, French, over the course of an entire year. It took that long for the students to be really successful. After that, they were able to accelerate the pace. And I know that most people don't have that option, but it's just a little glimpse into the kind of the differential in timing that it may take for some students to really to establish their foundational competence in a language. So some questions to consider: do you want students to be able to recognize the material in context or to retrieve it from memory? If you want them to retrieve it, what level of accuracy is going to be acceptable given the importance of the content? And this is where spelling, where teachers have to individually determine whether you're going to take off points for misspelled words, or how misspelled does a word have to be before it's not really that word at all. And those are hard questions. Textbooks often present problems of their own with just a lot too much stuff on a page. So I know at Landmark, the teachers designed their own textbooks, and they made them digital so that they could be revised frequently, and so that students, when reading, could adjust the size and the font and the background color and all those other things that make it easier for some people to read textbooks, as well as to get some text-to-speech support for hearing things read out loud. So the question is, are you presenting, when you're designing an activity, a learnable amount of material given how complex the task is? So for instance, the number of variables in a task. If you're asking, are you presenting a new sentence structure at the same time you're introducing a new vocabulary? It might be better to introduce the sentence structure using familiar vocabulary, or the vocabulary using a familiar sentence structure, than both at once. So, for instance, a Spanish teacher structured the dialogue to provide syntactic support while practicing new vocabulary. In terms of long-term assignments, breaking them down with interim deadlines, that can be really, really helpful. Instead of giving students more time, it's actually more helpful to give them less time to do individual steps of a project than a long time for a big final project. You can give students support for proofreading their own written work, such as an annotated proofreading checklist. So teaching to mastery. Yeah, if you can, when it's possible, building in ample time for practice so that practice becomes automatically, so retrieval becomes automatic. I know the language teachers at Landmark were very big on having students retake tests until students mastered the content to a certain level. And they provided a lot of visual support in the classroom as well. Certainly, that issue of spelling comes up again and again about, what are going to be your expectations around words having all the letters in the right order. One thing we found is that written tests can be a very inaccurate measure of what a student knows, and sometimes a student, can just recognize the shape of a word without actually knowing the word. So testing orally, whenever possible, was really helpful for establishing what students know individually. So trying to engage students, sometimes just listening to their oral language. I think at Landmark, they used language labs where the students practiced oral dialogues on their own time, and students were evaluated on their oral competence more than on their written competence. And so here's a sample from an oral language checklist that gives students very explicit information about what you expect and how they can prepare to meet your expectations. Okay, so the weak language areas are likely to be the sounds and the spelling. So it's very helpful to give explicit instruction that focuses on the sounds of words. And a lot of times we take that for granted, but it can be a real obstacle in learning new vocabulary. So showing students by exaggerating the shape, having them watch your mouth as you form the word, and then having a mirror so they can see how their mouth is shaped when they're saying the word. Those are things that we commonly use to help students who struggled with the phonology or the sounds of a word. Teaching the alphabet, and I think this in Cyrillic, it becomes really critical that students have like keywords for sounds. This is an old like Orton Gillingham technique where for each letter or sound, there's the letter, the way it sounds, and then a whole sentence in this case that utilizes that sound over and over again to help students really understand how that sound works. Pronunciation practice, either with a partner or a recording, saying these following words that shared some phonetic properties and differed in some ways. We talked a little bit about syllabicating words. You can, use your fingers, you can tap on the table, you can tap on your arm, and you can visually demonstrate the using a lot of kind of visual ways to unpack the way words look and sound. So the typical vocabulary sheet would have the target word, like los huevos, it's eggs, showing how it's syllabicated and accented, and then a kind of a trick for remembering how it's actually pronounced, a transliteration. And I think that in Cyrillic, where the vocabulary, where the alphabet is not giving you a typical clue, that could be really, really helpful. Experimented a lot with rebuses for showing pronunciation. These are where you represent the sounds with little pictures. So these are great. These were teacher created, but the students also did their own. So estudiante for estudiante. I love this one. Ingeniero for engineer in Spanish. Por favor. And this kind of the sillier the representations are, the more memorable they are. So these really help students who are struggling with vocabulary to develop their own mnemonic tools. So again, creating picture symbols for words and the realia, color coding, endings, repeating words with different emotions. Certainly using writing to support the oral because it allows for slower retrieval time. So when the students do a dialogue, they've got the scripts, but engaging in things like online chats and blogs and pen pals to reinforce the oral language proved to be very helpful. Writing dialogues with like pictures and visual support was helpful. And talking a lot about metacognition, how we learn. Well, how do I go about learning? What are the strategies that I can employ to help me become a better language learner? Turned out to be very, very important. So when students are aware of how they learn, they can put that knowledge to use in selecting and practicing strategies to make their learning more efficient. And it often leads to them understanding their native language better, and then they can also articulate their needs to instructors. So actively using the strategies in class, so when we actively practice them, it helps students become aware of their strengths and difficulties as learners. And I know with my students, a collaborative approach means that I didn't teach foreign language, but I did teach, writing and other things, and required strategy. And we'd present a range of strategies and encourage my students to experiment until they find the ones that work for them, and then they can modify them. And so let's look at some examples that turned out to be really helpful in language class. With activities, asking students to reflect on how they were learning those those activities frequently, not just once a year, but once a week or once a month, asking, is there something you discover that really helps your learning or gets in the way of your learning? Building them into activities. So I'm going to have you listen to a description of my sister, and you can guess what I'm saying. What am I saying? And how did you figure out what I was saying? What strategies did you use? Can you use them again? And some specific strategies that were commonly used were, let me show you. We know about flashcards. They came up with something called deluxe flashcards that not only have the word and the meaning, but some other helpful characteristics as well. So here's an example in Spanish of the word puedo. It sounds like, and again, that transliteration. But it reminds me of Play-Doh. So I'm going to make a sentence that I can play with Play-Doh, because it means I can. Play-Doh means I can. So the definition, I can, is helping students with a variety of kind of reinforcements for the way the word looks, sounds, and can be used. Mnemonics, these are, if you're teaching culture as well, these are mnemonics for the silly sentences for the countries of Central and South America. When encouraging students to create their own mnemonics usually is the best. Mnemonics for specific vocabulary using humor, like abrazar, to hug. You use your abrazos to hug. I embrace you with an abrazo. Abra hugs. Okay, that students remember that one. I'm going to actually skip over technology because it changes so fast, except to say that our teachers came up with a checklist for technology tools that, to be effective, students need to be able to control both the pace of how the information comes at them and the pace at which they respond. So if they're slower, they can slow it down. But the feedback has to be immediate, constructive feedback. And is it presented using visual, auditory, maybe tactile, maybe not, as well as just auditory? Is practice available in multiple formats? So it's speaking and writing and dialoguing. And is it structured for success? Am I going to get points off for spelling problems and other things? Oh, whoops, I didn't want to do that. Okay. Okay, do you all know about FLT Mag, this online? Yeah, okay, so I'll skip over that. There's a really good book by Conan Dyke called Foreign Languages for Everyone, by somebody who taught at, I think this was at Winthrop College, Calvin College. So basically, I'm winding down here. If we're going to help students make the leap from their native language to the second language, to teach the sound system explicitly, to structure for success so that we're not expecting more than they could do at any point in the program, to support the auditory with other kinds of multisensory activities. Give enough time for practice and mastery. To emphasize proficiency in communication over grammatical and spelling correctness. Be very explicit about your deadlines, and to talk a lot about strategies in metacognition as well, and use different kinds of assessment than just typical pencil and paper tests. And as the students at Landmark would say, and make it fun. And they wanted to emphasize that because the language classes were so much fun, and they involved a lot of singing, by the way, that they were able to feel successful in a study that they had never been open to them in the past. And they were, very successful language learners as a result. So I'm going to stop sharing, and I'd be happy to try to address some questions or respond to some of your observations.
Thank you so much, Linda. There is already a request. Will you be able to share your slides with us? And there are references to handouts on the slides.
Yeah, and I do have a set of handouts. If it would be useful, I can send to Irina. You already have my slides, but what I'll do is I'll send you a PDF version of the slides. And also I can send you a PDF of a handout packet. I think I brought it to Brandeis, and I wasn't sure how useful people would find it, but if people would find it useful, I'm happy to share that.
Thank you. I think it would be helpful.
Yeah. The handouts have a lot of those examples, and plus a lot more already kind of built in. It's maybe a 10-page handout or so, but yeah.
And then there are questions in the chat. John, do you want to ask a question live?
Sure. I was just wondering, Linda, thank you so much for this presentation. This is truly amazing.
Yeah.
And I'm looking forward to getting it, and I want to share it with my colleagues as well. Thank you very much. I was just wondering, with regard to Puedo, is there any sort of a risk that there would be like a misassociation with meaning? Let's say, in a classroom where we try to minimalize, English, and always stay in the target language. Is there any, has anybody experienced that, or can you speak to that at all, or?
I can't speak.
Is it irrelevant?
Yeah, I can't speak, from experience from that, in that one of the things that, yes, immersion is a really wonderful ideal. The students, and especially the ones who struggled a lot, would have been on kind of thin ice, I think, in an immersion classroom. They really benefited from having kind of the solid foundation of native language to be there to support them. So I think it depends on the competence, the basic competence of the students that you're working with. But I don't know the extent to which people could misconstrue the meaning.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, I wish I could, yeah.
And then there's a question from Valerie, and then Olga, you are next. So from Valerie, thanks so much, wonderful presentation. Yeah. Landmark connected to researchers of neuroscience or vice versa?
Oh, I'm looking for that. Oh, connect, yes. The part of Landmark that I worked in for the last 20 years, I was there from 1985 when they were founded until 2017 when I retired. My last 20 years were at the Landmark College Institute for Research and Technology. And we not only did a lot of professional development for educators, but we engaged in a lot of different kinds of research in effective practice, in everything from language studies to virtual reality, to work around metacognition, to work around therapy dogs in the classroom. They're engaged in really high level, some kind of basic research in I even got to do a little research project in using text to speech with students on students who had attention issues, not dyslexia, and whether that would improve their reading. So if you're interested, then I suggest you go to the Landmark College website and look up LCIRT, LCIRT, which stands for Landmark College Institute for Research and Training. Or also in the tabs in the top, I think there's a tab for professionals as well. And you should be able to get an overview of the kinds of research that they're currently engaged in. And I think they're often very interested in, talking with other institutions where there might be a collaboration of research. And the research is being shared everywhere. A lot of our research, I know a lot of it was funded by NIH, National Institute of Health, DOE, the Department of Ed. That's and shared at conferences like the AHEAD, which is the Association of Higher Education and Disability. Used to be called the Orton Society, the International Dyslexia Association, CHAD, Children and Adults with ADD. Yeah, the research is shared at major conferences.
Thank
And
you. I put the link to that website.
Yeah, they also run training institutes. I think there's a summer conference every year now still, and they attend many major conferences and do presentations. Yeah, thank you.
Olga.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Linda, for your wonderful presentation. Extremely helpful, a lot of information. So my question is mainly about, you did skip this section about technology, but I was curious, especially since the remote teaching, right? We start using a lot of technology, and I'm just wondering if for students with learning difficulties, technology becomes as like an additional stress, more overwhelming. Have you encountered that maybe students with learning difficulties would prefer more simple things, maybe handouts, maybe props, maybe like not use slides, maybe not use as much visuals and like bright colors and stuff? So especially, I don't know, maybe especially those who with attention deficit disabilities, maybe they need like, I'm just trying to figure out, maybe we need to kind of unload this, technology load, and maybe for these students, they require any additional unloading.
Yeah, it's an interesting and short question, because the technology has the advantage of being able to be highly engaging in so many ways. It can also be overwhelming, as you mentioned, and there's always the danger that it will present distractions of going off course into whatever else your computer is offering you, and sometimes having students put restrictions on their computers so that they can't do social media during certain hours of the day can be helpful. But it's interesting. Tommy is mentioning some high schoolers are ed tech adverse in the wake of the pandemic. And yes, you might have read a New York Times article about a girl in Brooklyn who founded the Luddite Club in Brooklyn. Then there are kids who have given up their smartphones willingly and are kind of giddy with the pleasure of meeting in person and doing things together. I think it's, we're in a period of incredible flux now about all of these things, and it's a frontier. I don't have any good answers. I think we have to find our way cautiously with the technology, but it does afford a lot of opportunities for individual practice that might otherwise not be available. And I know I just recently did a crash course with Duolingo because I went to Spain, and I won't say I learned a lot of Spanish, but I did learn enough to get to the train station when I needed to. So the technology, I think the individual opportunities for individual practice are highly beneficial. But yeah,
Lee, and maybe this will be the last question.
yeah,
Yes, Linda, I also wanted to thank you. It was such a tremendous presentation. And I think, the introduction in the beginning in terms of what people might see in their classrooms and the
Yeah.
separation of it into the different learning differences. And then the strategies, I think is amazing. As a pre-college teacher, I have the enormous benefit of getting learning profiles on my students. And so I know what the learning differences are. And so I can match them, to the strategies that you give. And our post-secondary colleagues don't have that because of, health, what's allowed to be shared. And so they really have to kind of do diagnostic experiencing in terms to even determine which strategies would help, because they're so different for different kinds of learners.
yeah.
And so it was I just wanted to say thank you. And having both of those two sides of this presentation is just tremendous.
Oh, well, thank you. You're very welcome. I'm glad that you found it useful. And somebody asked whether they could share slides with colleagues, and certainly yes, as long as there's a citation about their source. I like things to be disseminated for sure. But going back for post-secondary teachers, I would say that if you have a student who is struggling, if it seems if the student is comfortable having a conversation about their early education history and anything that might have been difficult, especially around, learning to read and write and spell, can give you tremendous insights into their learning profile. So, yes, that's a good, I highly recommend it if the student is open to discussing it. You don't have to say disability at all, which, in post-secondary settings, you're not supposed to ask a student if they have a disability. But you say, tell me a little bit about what it was like to learn to read and write and spell for you. That could open the doors to some good understanding.
That is a very useful suggestion. Katya, please.
Yeah, good.
Just-
Hi, hello. Thank you so much. It was very interesting and helpful, really. And I have a problem this semester that I have a student from China, and who is clearly has some difficulties, clearly probably dyslexic, because his English also is a little bit shaky, and he can repeat after I say words slow. He did all the things that you mentioned. He misspells, change one letter, I don't know, change to another letter in simple words, or yeah, all of this. Also, he mixes syllables, and so I'm not sure what to do, because he can hear and he repeats after me. When I say slowly, he repeats all right. But then when he says it himself, it's just a jumble of something often. So the thing is, the thing that confuses me, I don't know, I'm not sure what to do, because I am kind of feeling uneasy. Should I tell him, or rather I cannot tell him, look, probably would you go see speech therapist? Because I'm kind of feel that I'm not very comfortable saying this. So do you feel that that the teacher can do this, or he should go and seek professional help? What to do?
I would, and you're in, are you in a college or?
Yeah, university.
Yeah. So you have to be really kind of cautious in even raising a term like disability to a student or asking.
No. That's
Right.
my problem. I don't
So
know.
I think opening a discussion about, how is he experiencing your class, whether he's having difficulties, whether he has any insights. I mean, you can say, here's what I observe. I observe that when I tell you a word slowly, you repeat it back to me, but then soon afterwards, the word is out of the sounds of the word are out of order. Do you know what's going on? To try to state your observations and invite him to fill in any information if he can. He may not, but that's how I would do it. And I think then you're not violating any privacy or making any insinuations about it, but kind of open up
Oh,
the
no, yeah,
discussion.
of course.
Yeah.
But it's not that you can suggest seeing a speech therapist. It's kind of rude in my part. Yeah, I
Yeah,
didn't do this, and I kind of feel that I cannot, but I'm not sure what to do. So no.
You could, yeah, you
don't
could,
know.
well,
Yeah.
I think, so if you ask him, you know, your observations and ask him if he knows about whether there are, you know, services available for, or, you know, not resources, what resources there are for helping students on campus, I think, as I might put it that way.
Okay.
Is he
Alright.
aware of the resources?
Okay. Thank
Yeah.
you. Yeah.
Yeah,
Thanks.
with that, yeah.
Yeah, well, you know, let's stop here, although it's really, let me stop.